Hello, everybody, and welcome. We have our very special guest with us here today. It's no one else but the elusive and amazing Bill Kennedy. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andre.
So, Bill, um, a lot of Go developers, they've seen you all around the conference circuit, all around the world, probably every single continent. But I wanted to start with maybe you could tell us a bit about who the man behind the booth is, so to say. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Bill Kennedy, and for everybody in Europe who asks me, William is my legal name, and for some reason in the United States, Bill is a nickname for William. I don't exactly know why. Everybody has their ideas. But call me Bill when you see me. So, Bill Kennedy, one of the founders of Arden Labs, and we're a company that has been around for since 2011, or beginning like January 2011 we started. So however long that is, what, 13 years. We primarily focus on Go consulting, Go training, Rust consulting, Rust training, anything around Kubernetes and ops. We're kind of in all that good stuff. And Andre's right. I travel the planet training companies and engineers on how to write the best Go code that they could possibly write.
Yeah. And when you're not doing that, what do you do? What do you do for fun?
Well, I love and enjoy going out and sitting at restaurants and people watching with my wife. So when I'm not behind the computer, I might just say, "Baby, let's go grab a drink," and we'll pick a place in Miami and kind of just sit back for a couple hours. I enjoy that. I'm at a point where I'm 50, 55. I'm going to be 55 this year, and you can't play basketball anymore. And I got my original knees, and I want to keep them. So I'm not like I used to be more athletic when I was younger. I kind of backed off on that. And I love doing stuff around the house, especially outside, just keeping the house looking nice.
Amazing. So you mentioned you've done this for a while. So how did you sort of get into software engineering originally?
Oh no, man, I fell in love with in about 1985, I think, 84. My parents came home with a little Radio Shack computer that you plugged behind the TV and you used a cassette player to save and load. And I just started writing BASIC. And within about a month, I'd asked them for a new computer. I got a K Pro 2, CPM, Z80 chip. And those things were expensive. And my parents were not, by any stretch of the imagination, wealthy. I don't know how they did. Honestly, I don't know how they paid for it. Looking back at it as an adult, but they did. And so I just sort of pounded basic programming for a really long time until eventually I went to college and moved on to Pascal and C and all those things. But I was spending a lot of time, if I wasn't out playing sports, I was sitting behind a computer, just really enjoying basic programming.
Yeah. Here in Sweden, we had this program where we had this goal that every household should have a computer. This was like early 90s. And
Mm.
so the state went in and uh, made sure that that was actually affordable via sort of people's employers. So that was how I got into computing. But okay, so obviously the way we sort of program today has changed a lot since then. What was sort of your first experience with the cloud? Do you remember?
Um, I spent the first 20 years building software on the Microsoft platform. C and C, when C Sharp came out, I was doing that. And we were hosting all of our own systems. Almost every company had their own data center of some point. This was all the way back into even like the mid 2000s, right? I don't think the cloud actually starts showing its face until, I don't know, maybe, I don't know even what that is. I remember Oracle starting to talk about the cloud's going to be it maybe around 2006, 6, 7, 8 or something.
Yeah.
Um, but I wasn't that excited about Microsoft's cloud at the time, Azure. It just didn't feel. Remember, I'm old school at this point, right? And so this idea of losing control over the machines and trusting somebody else to do that at the time in the late 2000s when that would have been available didn't feel right. I still wanted to run my own SQL server and touch the box and feel like, hey, it's here. But what I found interesting was, at least on the Microsoft side, they were making it so expensive to run your own software with the licensing costs that you were being pushed into the cloud. Dude,
Yeah.
I hated that. Like, it's one thing to, I don't know, don't do something to make it so like cost wise, I have no choice. But that was around 2013, and I finally gave up on Windows, moved to Linux and things like that. Now, when I moved to Linux, everything was, then I fell in love with hosting, found Linode and DigitalOcean, and then realized as I was running my own company, why am I going to do the cost of buying machines and all that, right? This thing's reliable, and they were reliable, right? But I had to get through that sort of transition
Yeah.
around that. So probably my first experience with cloud anything was around 2013 with Linode, and I don't think I went into a cloud like a AWS or anything till much later.
Yeah. I mean, I often liken it to the sort of, as you point out, this over time we sort of get more and more comfortable with higher levels of abstraction, and what feels very sort of uh, uncomfortable at some point, we learn to appreciate that, okay, well, actually the reliability of this is fine. Like, I remember when the iPhone came out, the sort of primary complaint was, well, I can't replace the battery, myself. And, we've sort of become used to that idea of like, well, actually, the battery is really quite good. And of course, like if you keep a phone for several years, like eventually you need to replace the battery. But um, I think it's the same thing we're seeing with technology is, um, Docker came along and now we have a new way, and now that's sort of the new paradigm, and everything is based around deploying things via Docker, and then Kubernetes comes along, and you sort of have this over time, this shift in levels of abstraction. Does that resonate with
I,
you?
I think it's more about control. So I think what happens at some point is your initial reaction to things is, I don't want to lose control over that.
Yeah.
Like my whole service class is really about this idea of you can control every aspect of the software. That the majority of the code we write is in the standard library. There's very little we use, let's say, outside of the standard library, other than say database drivers and things you're not going to build, right? But every time you bring in a dependency, you're giving up a little bit of control. You say, I'm going to rely on this and I'm going to lose control over it. Now and go, we have all the source code, but how many people actually ever fork something and gain control over that dependency is rare, right? And so for me, it's a matter of control. How much control do you want to give up? There's the trade-off, right? And the trade-off is, if I give up a lot of control, maybe I can move faster and I have more freedom and flexibility. But when there are problems, I have less ability to handle that. And so that's the scary part of giving up control, is you have to be super um, dependent on something and trust it. And if that thing you've given up control for has been reliable and is trustworthy, then you are thankful you made the decision. But when that thing is not trustworthy and not reliable, you're beating yourself up all the time until a point where you got to take control back. So I think if you're in the market of building things that you want people to depend on or rely on, you cannot burn those bridges out of the box, right? You've got to
Yeah.
make people feel like this is something they can give give up control over, because I like the idea of the air conditioner. You don't think about your air conditioner in any place that you're in unless it breaks down, and you start to get really uncomfortable. So the things that you're going to give control up, the things you're going to take, lose control over, they don't function like air conditioners where they're just reliable and you never think about them day in, day out. It's painful. But when they do, I'll give up all the control I want. So the idea of giving up the hardware, because if it breaks, who am I going to call? Eventually you're like, you know what, this stuff's reliable, it doesn't break. Okay, I'm willing to give up that control for the flexibility. And it's software too, right? I'm willing to use this package or this module because I trust that it's gonna be reliable.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, trust is the real key piece there. I mean, it's the same sort of success story behind both the Linux kernel and its commitment to backwards compatibility that sort of effectively the Go team adopted from 1.0, whereas that actually we have an extremely strong commitment to backwards compatibility. We want programs that are written for Go 1 to continue compiling indefinitely with very minor exceptions. I think that's been one of the huge selling points of Go success, and the fact that you can trust it and that version upgrades are not scary. So how do you decide when to adopt a new piece of technology? Because clearly the answer can't be, we're not gonna use anything. We're gonna, build everything from scratch. You end up depending on, modern technology stack. Once you make the decision to deploy to Kubernetes, you're depending on, under the hood, probably hundreds of millions of lines of code, down the tech stack.
I think the Go team did two really important things early on, which when you sit back and think about it, I don't know how they were this far ahead of their time in thinking, other than I guess they lived in this world that I didn't live in. One, they produced a really complete standard library that they built pretty much themselves. You don't see that in Rust, and you don't see that in sort of other languages. And so there's this inherent trust in that standard library, right? And it's built really well. And then I think the fact that they have closed governance, right? They have open source, but I think it's the closed governance piece that in the early days everybody was screaming about. But I think that's helped create the trust because that's giving you the stability for all that backwards compatibility. And so I think those two things were really huge. So if you're going to be bringing in any sort of third-party tech, I think what I want is, obviously, I want to feel a sense of stability by the people that are working on it, right? I can't have the next version breaking all my stuff, whether that is breaking APIs so my code doesn't build, or breaking behavior that, I'm sorry that it was a bug for you, but now it's a feature, right? And so people that are really sort of focused on that, it has to be closed governance as far as I'm concerned. You just can't, anybody can't just make a choice in how things are going to change. And you need to feel that sense of a strong commitment to that backwards compatibility and reliability, whether that's a module, API, or an entire system, right? And I've worked with some tech, I'm not going to name it, where I thought those things were in place. And unfortunately, after months, they weren't. And now you're scrambling, right, to replace it and fight through it. So as a general rule, you might sometimes not even know whether or not you have those things until, unfortunately, much farther down a pipeline. But at least that's what I'm looking for, right? I'm looking for that stability. I'm looking for seriousness and governance over what this thing is. And when somebody says no, just to me on something, I don't get upset. I'm like, this is good. right? You don't think this is going to benefit the majority of people, so you're pushing back. Hey, it's exactly what you should be doing, right?
Yeah. And I imagine you mentioned earlier that sort of one of the guiding principles behind your service starter project and your training is this notion of maintaining control over the things that are critical to you. Um, how what sort of principles, and I imagine that's sort of your experience and the fact that you've actually gone through so many sort of iterations of technology that also lends a lot of sort of credibility to the fact that actually you have the ability to sort of discern what you feel is trustworthy based on not just the latest hype cycle, but also, having the experience to back up your reasoning. And you've seen sort of this worked in the past, that not working so well. Uh, could you share some of like what's the overall principles behind the sort of service project and how you've structured it?
So just a little history. I started as an IT person, really, IT / software development. This was back in the 90s. When hardware broke back in the 90s, if you didn't have the spare card in the closet, you were done, right? Until you could get a part. I hated that. I hated not being able to fix something quickly. I very quickly got out of hardware. And I always felt if I stick with software and it's my bug, then I can fix it. So that's where that idea of how much of that software do you want to give up? Because if there's a bug and you don't own that line of code, you're back to the same thing. I need to order a card. So I never want to be in that situation. And so if I'm going to give up control over something, then I also have to feel confident that if there's a problem with that, that someone's going to be responsive and not leave me in the dark. So, I mean, I think that's another thing. So the service project is trying to accomplish a few things, a handful of things. One, it is a starter kit for building, I think, very robust production-oriented services. So there's a lot of people who build these services that and Go is so amazing that you can hack on something and it'll be fairly solid and you could put it in production and it will work. But we all know what's going to happen eventually. New people will come on it. You don't really have frameworks and patterns and guidelines and rules. And eventually that code is all going to just be a mess and break down. So this starter kit is about giving you a really clean architecture, an architecture around packaging, around layering, around domains, um, showing you how to really leverage the power of Go in terms of API design, when to decouple, when not to decouple, how to do these sorts of things, and giving you a full mental model of that code base so you could take it the way I do into your next project, rip apart the things you don't need, put in the things that you do, but you know that you're starting on a really solid footing of engineering that is, in some cases, 30 years old, because that's how long I've been writing software. But I would say some of the best practices in terms of Go. But you're managing everything. You're managing the protocol or transport layer of code, right? You're managing your application layers, your business layers, your storage layers, how they all interact, data integrity, right? All of these things, right? I teach you, and then you have full control over the entire stack. And there's a good feeling about that, right? But at the same time, it's a lot of work. And I always think of scales. So if you're willing to put in the work and do the right things and put in the time, you're going to have a very solid piece of software. But this takes time. If you decide to cheat on that time, how solid, what happens to your software? When I say solid, I don't mean running in production at top speed. I mean your ability to maintain, manage, and debug it. So there's always this sort of balance. Even right, you don't want to tip the scales like this either. You won't get anything done.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of finding that balance, right? And so this class is really about people who want to feel very proficient in their ability to write Go code, to write services, and to think about architecture and all of those things that are important no matter kind of what you're building. And I think the first commit is probably a good 6, maybe even 7 years on this project. So I learn stuff all the time, and I reincorporate it back into this service. I'm on my 6th video of recording of teaching this stuff, and I get excited when I see something. I watched Johnny Bersico give a talk yesterday on some HTTP stuff and realized I was missing a few things, which hasn't affected any piece of code in production, but at the same time, it's like, these are missing. They should be there. I should teach this.
Yeah.
So to me, the service repo it's been a labor of love, but I'm really excited about it.
I mean, I think that's what's so valuable is the fact that you are iterating on it and you're not treating it as a fixed thing, but as you sort of accumulate experiences, or you can pick sort of like, oh, this person came up with something interesting, and you incorporate that, and it evolves and gets better. I think that also lends a lot of sort of trust and credibility to the fact that you can rely on this because it's been put through its paces, so to say. So over the past couple of months, I want to say you've done a real deep dive into Encore, and I guess it started when we had I came onto your podcast, and after that we got talking, and I would love to hear sort of if you can take us back to when you started playing around with Encore. Like, what was that experience like? You've built a sort of replica of the service starter project in a way that's sort of adapted to Encore. But what was sort of day one like for you?
So I'm going to turn the clock back a little bit longer, like a year before that.
All right.
A year before that, I ended up talking to the Server Weaver team at Google. They had just published that big announcement that they had this framework that can take your code and build individual services and deploy it and all this stuff. And they had come to me and asked, Bill, how do we really present this to the Go community in terms of building? And I said, well, let's rebuild the service repo and the constructs and the ideas that are in there. Let's do it in Service Weaver. Let's see if Service Weaver can maintain the design philosophies and the guidelines and the architecture and the things we're doing there, and build sort of put Service Weaver on top of that. Long story short, I couldn't get that to work. And I don't know if it's just because I didn't put in enough effort, or it just wasn't really gonna happen. So I kind of got abandoned. I left a bad taste in my mouth, but it also, in my head, proved that the service project was what really people really needed. Because if you go to one of these frameworks, right, you're going to lose your ability to maintain your own architecture and design. You're going to lose your ability to have control over the way data flows. You lose your ability to do these things. It just strengthened my resolve in what I had done. And then you and I had just randomly kind of got on a conversation. And I was at a point where it felt like the service repo it's never done, but it's this moment where there wasn't anything new that I felt it needed at the time.
Yeah, it was a mature project.
It's mature, right? And I really liked it, and I felt like it was in a really good place. And so you and I having that conversation, I don't remember how many months ago it was. It was just perfect timing, because I was like looking for something new to kind of work on in between training and stuff. So I said, you know what? Let me do this experiment again. It didn't work for Service Weaver. In the back of my head, I was like, it's not going to work with Encore either. But I'm not going to say that to André. He's a good guy. I'm going to put in the same sort of time and effort into Encore as I did. And if I can pull it off, then this is nice because I think it's an alternative for people who don't want to use Kubernetes and want that sort of ops stuff to be done for them, which I love, right? I'm a big fan of Go Run and the Google stuff, right? The Google Run and Build and stuff, because I have to think about it, right? But this even takes that to the next level because it's on the it's just same thing, sir, right? It's on the CLI tool and you just do it. And I said, well, this would be kind of cool because then I don't need Kubernetes to deploy a set of microservices. Encore will just take care of that. From my perspective, it all works the same. What do I care how it's necessarily, not that Encore can't work in Kubernetes because you're building Go binaries, but the idea is I could just deploy this 10 times easier than I don't even have the service class working in a Kubernetes cloud environment just because the complexity to do that, I'll never be able to teach it. So
Yeah.
I run it in a local Kubernetes environment, but that's 80% the same really, right? So I said, let me do this. So I spent the first couple of weeks learning how Encore works. I started learning how do you define routes? How does middleware work? How does accessing the database work? How does so all these little constructs. And I started writing some small little programs. And then when I felt like I had enough, I said, okay, let me see if I can plug this on top of the domain-driven data-oriented architectures that I have. And something magical happened. What I realized was, and something that was lacking in the service repo actually, was that Encore was taking care of all of the protocol/transport issues. You were handling underneath the covers anything related to HTTP. And your concept was, at least on that side to begin with, was, hey, your application shouldn't care what the transport layer is. What it should care about is that there's this API. It accepts this data model. You need to return that data model. And how that is transported over the internet or between you and the computer and all that shouldn't be your concern, right? And the bulk of that type of code is really mundane and repetitive boilerplate anyway, right? It's stuff you have to code, but it doesn't necessarily tie directly into the problems you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
So I saw this super interesting, clear separation of what I call the protocol transport layer, which for you was the API, and then my application layer, which understood what these APIs needed to do in terms of an application and business logic. And so I quickly said, okay, my application layer is very protocol specific. In the service project, my application layer were HTTP handlers, response writers, and requests. And you're like, no, Bill, your API, your app layer shouldn't be response writing request. Your app layer should be app model in, app model out. I'll do the rest. So I quickly rewrote the app layer APIs, moved them away from protocol transport stuff to data models. And my brain just went, okay, this is super cool because I don't now worry about HTTP. But, Encore is going to be restricting me, right? Encore is not going to let me manage my own sort of error document. Well, the error document that Encore is using is pretty much the one I'm using, so that's not a problem. Yeah, but it's going to restrict me from doing certain things I want to do. No, no. And I kept going back to no. And every time I pushed back on Encore, my brain went, why am I asking for that? What I'm asking for is protocol. It's not app. Stop asking for protocol support. Start asking for app support. And I very quickly started to realize the power of Encore in terms of ripping apart, removing all the HTTP sort of protocols with the idea that you could replace that with gRPC or something else if you wanted to. And then you start thinking about provisioning, right? So how do you deal with the database? So all the apps I write have a database, and you had a mechanic of a way of defining what the database is, and you behind the scenes running it and managing it. And at first I was pushing back, like, why are you doing that? I want control over that. And then I went, you know what? Let that go, because it's actually nice. It's actually doing things for me that are much better than what I have to do, say, over here. Um, and allowing me to put things in certain places in the project also gave me that, because once you start telling me what I can't do, that's when a framework starts to really hurt. And I would say that the few things that Encore tells me that I can't do, um, it's just not even that bad. And in some cases, I moved it over. So if you were to look at the service project now, from the time I finished the Encore work to where we are, I added that API layer to the service project. I now separate the protocol from my app layer. So if you were to look at the service project and the Encore project, essentially, except for how the middleware works, because there's just some differences, the app layer, the business layer, and my foundation and storage layers are identical. 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 The app layer is almost identical, mainly just because of middleware. And I have to code this entire API layer that I get for free in Encore. And when I say free, we're talking about 5,000 plus lines of code that I no longer manage in Encore, that I have to manage in service. And so what's interesting to me is this idea of control again. So do I need control over my little web framework and over the HTTP handlers and everything related to my API layer? I would argue that if I can leverage if I'm going to run this software in an environment that Encore can deploy itself into, my answer is like, I can trust Encore, and why would I want to do that at this point? But now it's the control over deployment, right? Can I give up control over how things are deployed and trust Encore with
Well,
its dashboard and stuff? I think it always comes back down to that, Andre.
yeah.
Can I trust and give up control? And every time I say yes, I think my life is better for it when I'm still allowed to have the flexibility around architecture and design,
Yeah.
which
I mean,
Encore has not restricted me from.
yeah. I mean, so I want to get more into the infrastructure part, but before we move on there, I think you said something that was really interesting, which is uh, you started out coming into Encore with this notion of, I want to specify every last detail of the transport protocol. And whereas what Encore is advocating is, as you said, to express and reason about APIs in terms of data structures and domain modeling. And sort of our philosophy is that it's sort of that of escape hatches, right? Where typically the reason why Encore is useful is for sort of building, developing software, for building and evolving and sort of building new things. And with that, it can be really powerful to say, I want to focus on the business logic, the application layer, and leave the transport layer. And you get a lot of tooling out of Encore from that. But I think what's really important is sometimes you do need full control over the transport protocol. You need to be able to control every last detail. And so our philosophy generally is, provide this really nice level of abstraction for when you don't need to specify, every last detail. And then that is a trade-off because, as you say, like, well, Encore takes care of the structure of the error response. And that's typically fine most of the time. But if I really, really need to control that, there is this mechanism, in this case, like a raw endpoint, where you can drop down an abstraction level and you do get access to the raw HTTP handler and you can do whatever you want. And the trade-off is you don't, because Encore can no longer understand the structure of the API with like, okay, exactly what data types are being involved, you don't get things like automatic API documentation because suddenly it's a dynamic schema where you can do whatever you want, and Encore won't understand, at by just analyzing the source code what the request looks like. So we always think of it as a set of trade-offs where if you really want the sort of raw flexibility of doing everything by hand, you should be able to drop down an abstraction level and do that. And then when you want to instead make the trade-off of let's just focus on this higher level of abstraction, that will give you a lot of sort of additional value, but the choice is yours. So do you feel like that, from your experience, does that work in practice? Do you feel like actually you have the ability to drop down an abstraction level, or do you feel like no, actually it's very constraining and I'm sort of feeling locked in a cage, so to say?
I would say this. After building out the service project in Encore, and learning like this idea of transport separating your app and all that, I do use the fallback handler for that one package, the StatsViz package that's using WebSockets. And there were some like weird origin problems or something with it when I was running it locally. And so that fallback handler like saved me there. So I was grateful it's there. But what I would say is that if you're using the fallback handler for anything but these really weird, crazy special cases, then you're kind of losing the beauty of Encore and what it is. And I would also question why you can't have a app layer API that's using data models that doesn't tie in. And so I think it's great to have Encore extend the raw handlers, but it should be, every time you're using it, it should smell like, why am I doing this? Like, what is it that um, I'm doing that I need to be here? And the answer is going to be, yeah, like I just said, like I had a WebSocket issue with something and I had to control it. But overall, that should be an exception, sort of not a rule. When it comes to that stuff, I think the real power was that I was able to basically move my architecture and my APIs, my app layer APIs and business and storage, and go like this, bring it over and rip out my API layer for Encore's API layer. Yeah, it just works, right? I mean, you have your own logger. I have to make some changes around there, but that's quick stuff. I think that's the power. I didn't see it at first, right? You basically said we're gonna do the transport layer for you. There's some and provisioning of resources like databases and PubSub, and we're gonna make that so it's not too restrictive. I think also what was brilliant, and it forced me to add it to the service project, but I had to code the whole thing by hand, was that you made an assumption which I'm not sure it was a good assumption to make, but nonetheless you made it. That these sorts of services, or say apps that have auth, will run their own auth service in essence. So that auth handler, right? You can only have one. And so here's an interesting sort of restriction that took me by surprise. Okay, when I was porting over the service, the sales service, it does auth. So I use the Encore auth handler to do that. No big deal. And then somebody in Discord was like, "It's a bummer. I can only have one auth handler." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" "Yeah, you can only have one." So I added a second service, and sure enough, that had to be shared. And then I was like, Andre, what's going on? Well, that's an auth handler. One of those two services has to host it because that service would be handling auth. And I went, well, I want both of them to call the auth handler so I can do it locally. That's not how it works, right? With the idea that there's somebody handling auth. So I was like, whoa. But what's interesting is it's not a burden because I don't have to build HTTP-based clients. I just have to make a function call between the two services at this point, right? Because you're extending a function out of service A, there's the auth handler, and then like there's service B. And so it's just a matter of saying service A dot API. I want to make that API call. You underneath the covers turn that into a whole sort of transport layer code that's there. So I said, all right, let me add an auth service to my Encore project, and I'll have my sales service. I'll make the auth service the one that really deals with the auth handler, and this service will call into it. I did that so quickly, it was mind blowing, like mind blowing how quickly I got that to work. So I said, I'm going to do the same thing in service. And it wasn't quick, right? It was at least, and only because I know Go, it was probably 4 hours of coding. I had to add a service. I had to do the endpoints. I had to have the API layers there. Then I had to build a new package that was the auth client that did the transfer, right? See what I'm saying? Where in Encore, it was just like, but that was an interesting constraint because but it's okay. What I want to stress is that the best modules out there, the best anything out there is opinionated and has strong opinions and sticks to their guns on those opinions. And so, though at first it took me back as, why did you make that decision? At some point I go, well, it is what it is. That's the decision that was made. It's not going to change. And it's not hurting me. So let it go, right? And it's those little things that I learned so much from in Encore that I brought back to this. The service class is better today because I tried to port it in Encore, and Encore taught me things I had never thought about, like that separation, better ways of testing, better ways to think about even microservices in a sense. I'm really grateful for the time there. And even if, and I plan to do Encore training, I plan to, basically, the idea is you can take the service class. This is the way I'm thinking about it, Andre, for bigger classes, right? You teach a service class. You teach somebody the pain of building that API layer and building the little web frameworks and building all that. And then say, okay, let's take the bulk of the code we had, let's rip out the API layer, let's put in Encore, let's look at how much code we just didn't have to maintain anymore. And boom, look what just happened, right? And I think then people will get it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sometimes you do need that level of control, and it's Encore is not the right level of abstraction for every project. And I think knowing it is really valuable to know how to do things yourself, even if because then you can choose to use an abstraction with the understanding of what that gives you. Not having that knowledge means you're sort of, oh, it's doing some magic, right? But I think going back to your auth handler example, maybe it's useful to share. Encore fundamentally is designed around building distributed systems, and you can use it to deploy in lots of different configurations. As you pointed out, you can take it and you can deploy it to Cloud Run, and Encore can take a distributed system and just package it into a single container and sort of miniaturize it. But it also supports deploying to Kubernetes. And then you're getting, a fully distributed system. Encore will deploy to your Kubernetes cluster and set up API gateways and tons of services and so on. But the decision around the auth handler, it really stems from the fact that typically in a distributed system, you really want to, in my experience, you want to be able to authenticate the incoming request at the API gateway, so that you can decide, like, should we actually, is this a valid request or should we just reject it outright? And so when Encore deploys to Kubernetes, it sets up an API gateway as a dedicated container that is aware of, okay, if the request contains these parameters, whether it's like an HTTP header with an authorization header or whatever, that's the shape of what the auth handler is interested in. So it will inspect the incoming request and say, okay, does it have this header? Okay, then I'm gonna call the auth handler. And it needs to know, which service does this live in, because it needs to reach out somewhere. And then once the auth handler has decided, okay, actually this request is valid, then Encore will propagate the auth information to all downstream services. And if those services call other services, the auth information will be propagated, all along that chain. And so that's sort of the mindset that led to auth handler. It's not intended to be global, but it's intended to be, it's really about associating it with the API gateway. And currently Encore only supports a single API gateway, but that's a restriction we're working on lifting. And as soon as you can have multiple API gateways, then you can have multiple auth handlers, one per API gateway. That's sort of how we're thinking about the common use cases where you do want to authenticate incoming requests, and you want to do that as early as possible before you sort of call into a bunch of other services. I don't know if that sort of makes sense in your experience.
It does, I think, and I think most systems have a separate service that's handling. Like, you never roll your own. I love Open Policy Agent, and there's services that can be that service for you, right? So,
yeah,
in my original world, like my sales service, if it was going to be talking to an auth service, would have been, say, an OPA service. Now, the way I've got it is you would talk to the auth service that we built that either runs OPA locally, which it does today, or it can shell out again, right? You just don't roll your own. So
yeah,
um, it forced me to do something that I wasn't going to do, but I think now everything is better for it. So, but it's these like ideas I got to sort of learn things from you from the code base on how to think about some of this stuff differently. When you're not, I try to work on at least one client project a year. I'm working on one now. And it's these client projects that always allow you to sort of open your mind to new things. So I always feel like if you're a trainer and you're not doing client work or building things at least for a few months every year, then what you're teaching is going to stagnate, right? So for me, Encore was this incredible, it ended up being, and I didn't go into it with this mindset. It ended up being this amazing experience of being able to like almost peek into your brain and what you thought services were and what they needed. And again, it allowed me to kind of incorporate new and definitely some interesting ideas back into the service class that I can now teach. And so, again, if you learn, so now when I teach service, I'm always like, okay, let's do, Encore will do all this for us. But since we're here, we're going to build it ourselves, right? And throughout the class, I'm always like, man, if we had Encore, we wouldn't have to do this. But because that's what's going on in my head all the time. It's just like, if I had Encore, I wouldn't be here right now. I think that's surprisingly cool.
Yeah. I mean, the collaboration goes both ways, where from sort of day one when you started exploring and using Encore, you've shared your experiences and where you're coming from, And likewise, Encore is better for that. We've made a huge amount of improvements and uh, sort of added new functionality as a result. Because, as you said earlier, the goal is it's really to help developers, build faster with higher quality and really offload a lot of the sort of nuisance and of software engineering and distributed systems. But it shouldn't get in your way of, being able to express yourself the way you want to. So Encore is quite, it's quite opinionated at the edge of like, well, if you want Encore to help you with this, here's how you have to do it. And then as soon as you get beyond that boundary, the goal is that it's essentially fully open-ended. Like it doesn't put any constraints on how you're expressing the business layer or the application layer. Once you get past the sort of boundary of like, well, this is the shape that you have to define things in, and then you can do whatever you want. But it's, doing that successfully is a matter of, a lot of hard work in making sure that different ways of doing testing are well supported. And Encore is better for that from your experience of how to do testing and sort of how to express, business logic. So I'm super grateful for all of your feedback as well. And yeah, so thank you.
I love that. You're right. It's Encore is only constraining you on the edge. And when you look at why it's constraining you, you you're okay with it. Like you look at it and say, well, if I was writing Encore, I would have to have done the same things. And so since the benefit outweighs this tiny constraint, it's not even I'll live with it. It's cool. It's fine, right? It's that kind of thing every time. And I've never not found a workaround on something on the edge that I wasn't happy with. So I agree. It's just on the edge. And then you can make everything else that you want your own sort of underneath it. And then you get all the benefits of the deployment. Like in the Encore class, what's brilliant is my second lesson is always our deploy first mentality. Now in the Kubernetes class, we deploy to a local Kubernetes environment, right? And that's what we're doing all class and the engineering that goes on with that. But in the Encore class, we can deploy first to the Encore cloud, which I'll never do in the other class because to even imagine setting that up is, forget it. I'd lose too much time. But I lose no time for people who want to register an account on Encore and take this code and set it up. You can literally run it locally and run it in the cloud almost day one when you begin. And that, I know for me, feels magical. And I think for students, it will feel just magical.
Yeah. Well, that's the idea. I'm glad to hear it works out in your experience. So I think that's all for today, Bill. Thank you very much for joining us. And for those who are interested in Ardan Labs Go training, maybe you can share where they can find you.
So I'm scheduling for the week of June 10th. Let me double check that. I'm almost positive it's June 10th. We're going to do I'm going to do my first Encore training. It'll be from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern time for those 5 days. And it will be the ultimate software design with Encore. And what we're going to do is give André a special code for people who join Discord. And for any clients of Encore, they'll gain access to this code. And we'll give them deep discounts into joining the class. Like, I don't know what the numbers are going to be, but I think we're looking at like maybe $50 for what is normally like an $800 class. Just pay a little bit just so my marketing and sales team don't completely beat me up. But that's the idea. So June 10th through the 14th. And if you want to take that class for ridiculously small price, then you got to get on the Encore Discord and ask for that. Or if you're already a client or you work for a company that's already a client, you can ask for that discount. And I hope to get a bunch of people in there, and I'm going to share the beauty of data-oriented, domain-driven design with the beauty of kind of Encore. It all comes together in a beautiful symphony, man, for that week, and I'm excited.
I definitely encourage everyone listening to check that out. Bill is a world-renowned Go trainer, and we're super excited to bring these two worlds together into a symphony of Go backend development, distributed systems programming. So it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, cool.